Hi, I'm Bob. Tonight we're going to work on the nozzle and the heat block on the Anycubic Vyper. Again, tonight's video is not sponsored by anybody, so if you feel like helping out, I have a PayPal link down below in the description. There's also a couple of Amazon links down in the subscription. They are affiliate links, so if you click on those links and then go click on anything else you would normally buy after that, it'll help out with a couple cents on each purchase that you do. It doesn't have to be what's in the links. You can click on that link and then go to whatever you were going to purchase, and it helps out. All right. So tonight's issue, a lot of the nozzles are leaking from around the threads. The nozzle needs to bottom out on the heat break, not the heat block. So what has to happen is the nozzle has to loosen up or come out, depending on if you're going to change the nozzle or not. And the heat block needs to screw one turn tighter, which will that will raise the heat block up higher on the heat break, and that way the nozzle can come up and be in contact with the heat break instead of the heat block. You're going to need a wrench for the heat block. You're going to need a wrench or a socket for the nozzle, and your 2mm Allen wrench for the screws to get access to it. And that should be it. Let's get down to the other camera and we'll get going. Please be sure to like and subscribe. It really does help a lot. Appreciate it. Okay, so you're gonna want to use your 2mm Allen wrench. And remove the 4 screws from the back of the hot end housing. 3 of the screws are the same. 1 of them is different. Looking at it, the one in the top left hand side is a flat head, and the rest are button heads. Okay. Now you are going to want to unplug the cable. Pull the cover up and away. You have to get it from behind the plug and between the screw. And you can move it over to the side and turn it without unplugging all of the plugs. It's probably a good time now, if you wanted to, you could get your cell phone out and take a picture of how everything's plugged in case if something does come unplugged and you have to see how to plug it back in. Okay, next you are going to want to take the 2 screws out of the top of the strain gauge. And if you have the holder printed out, you can use it. Okay. Now, I've got the silicone sock on mine. It just pulls right off. And I say that and it's really stuck on there. There we go. Be careful with the thermistor and the heater wires. The thermistor wires are very, very, very thin, and they'll break easily. Okay, so you can see the nozzle. There's a little bit of plastic there. The nozzle should not have the flat spots come up and hit the heat block. They should actually bottom out on the heat break before they ever touch the heat block. Let's see if I have one here. Okay. This is what the heat break looks like. This is what goes up inside the heat sink, and then this screws into the heat block. Then the nozzle needs to screw into the heat block until it hits the heat break. That's what is supposed to get it to stop, the heat break. Not having this come up and hit the top of the heat block. There should be, even if it's a millimeter gap, that's fine, but there needs to be a gap there, and this needs to bottom out against this. That's not happening with most people's. They're having it look like that. So what we're going to have to do is leave it plugged in until we can get it heated up so that we can get the nozzle broke loose, and then the heat block broke loose. Okay, so now we need to plug the cable back in. And we need to heat the hot end up to 230, 240 degrees. Okay, it's heating up. As soon as it hits about 100 degrees, you want to retract the filament because there's no fan blowing on the hot end right now, so we don't want anything to melt up inside of it. Once it hits about 100, you shouldn't have any issues turning it with the knob on the extruder. Okay. So we're going to need a wrench to put on the heat block to hold it, and I have a socket for the nozzle. Now, since the nozzle's heating, you should be able to get a pair of tweezers and pull any plastic that's leaked off of it. Okay. I'm going to get a wrench on there. Again, being careful with the thermistor wires. Usually this is a little easier. It's a little hard for me right now, trying to keep the camera on it. Go ahead and get the nozzle out. Now at this point you're going to have to unplug the thermistor and the heater, and be very, very careful because they're hot. Okay, you'll have to pull the two wires out. You want to hold the hot end, and you want to turn the heat block clockwise, one turn. Okay, now I'm not going to turn this one because I've already done that, and I know it's in the right spot. Okay, and this is the same procedure you would use with changing the nozzle. So we'll go ahead and pull the nozzle out. Preferably before it cools off and gets stuck in the socket. Now the socket's going to be hot too from having the hot nozzle in it. Now before it cools off, you want to go ahead and get your nozzle, your new nozzle in it. Oops. Okay, before you get it all the way tight, you're going to want to plug the thermistor and the heater plugs back in. Get it heated back up to 240 degrees. And you're going to want to tighten the nozzle pretty tight at 240 degrees. If you don't do it with it hot, you'll never get it seated against the heat break good. Okay. So now that's it for that. You can see there's a gap here, and it stopped getting tight when it hit the heat break instead of going up and bottoming out on the heat block. Now we can go ahead and turn the heat off going to it. It takes a good long time for that heat sink to get hot. I mean, you figure it's been a good couple minutes and it's not hot enough that I can't hold it. So the heat break and the heat sink are working just like they're supposed to be. Okay, so it's cooled off pretty good amount. It's down to 95 degrees, so it won't boil water at least. Hopefully we've got everything plugged back in now. Didn't have to unplug. If you wind up unplugging the fan and the LED and the part cooling fan, it's not a big deal. Everything is labeled here. It looks like I do have one fan here that pulled out. It's not a big deal. We'll get that plugged back in. Okay, everything's plugged in. We'll go ahead and get that back unplugged, unscrewed. And it's going to go back together pretty much the same way it came off. Still being very gentle with the strain gauge. Okay, the screws that hold the strain gauge to the X carriage, you're going to want to make sure they're tight. I know these are tight because I just tightened them. You can go ahead and get your silicone sock back on. And everything else goes back on the way that it came apart. And when you put the screws back in the cover, or pretty much anything that has more than one screw, you always want to get all the screws started before you tighten any. That way you're sure that everything's lining up and it's easier to get all of the screws back in. Be sure to get the one screw that's different in that top left. Okay. All right, now that everything is secure, plug everything back in. You're going to want to connect it back here with the tie wrap. Go ahead and power the printer off. Back on. And we're going to check the strain gauge operation. And yep, LED's out, comes on when I push up. So anytime you change anything with the nozzle or the hot end, you're going to want to do a new auto level, and you should be good to go. Okay, now when you change your Bowden tubing, we have the old out, the connectors screwed in. You're going to want to take the Bowden tube with the temperature up to temp 230 or so. Make sure it's in as far as it goes. Go ahead and loosen the connector a half a turn. And push it back down in that little bit further. And then go ahead and tighten it. Doing it that way that last half a turn, make sure that the Bowden tube is pushed all the way in and hitting the back of the nozzle. Alright, and that's that.